Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Namaste. In this lecture numbered 9, we would try to understand as to why it is important to engage with scientific epistemology, why all the discussions that we had in the previous lectures is important in the context of social sciences in South Asia, in broader spectrum, in India in particular, why within social sciences sociology stands as an entity to be scrutinized in the light of engagement within positivist framework as well as development that happens in the so called post positivist social sciences. To begin with, we shall recognize that there is a trope of crisis in various disciplines of social science that hogs our attention. Closer home in India, the enumeration of crisis in sociology is accompanied by similar apprehensions about the nature of social science in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and so forth. The Marxist social scientist named Tom Baltimore, visiting India sometime in late 1960s, anticipated the crisis in sociology in India on various accounts, including the sheer lack of intellectual boldness and controversies in India. Lately, in the decade of 2000, some of the sociologists began to take note of crisis, manifold crisis in sociology. In that spirit, one can also share an apprehension that an anthropologist named T. N. Madan shared with us. His apprehension was a kind of lament about the lack of attempts to rescue the pioneers of sociology and social anthropology from what he called disciplinary amnesia. Disciplinary amnesia, following which those pioneers and their contributions have been forgotten very safely by the practicing sociologists and anthropologists in contemporary Indian social sciences. It is related to the lack of theorizing in social sciences in India. Indian social scientists don't spend time in engaging with the intellectual traditions as well as modern thoughts in order to theorize. On the trope of crisis, there are other usual and expected lamentation. This is lament about the decline in the vaguely defined and debatable categories such as quality and standards, ironically coupled with the clarion call of pluralizing sociology in contemporary India. Perhaps the two are interrelated and it requires a critical exploration on some other occasion. What we have done is just briefly flagged it for our attention at this moment. It is interesting to note that the trope of crisis in sociological self-reflection surfaced elsewhere much before sociologists in India took to talk about it. Placed in different context of Western sociology, nonetheless, it contributed more than mere crisis mongering. It is one thing to identify a crisis as a monolith it is yet another thing to find the means to address the crisis. Hence, a critical and sought after thinker in the 1970s, Alvin Goldner, evoked the idea of crisis to pave the way for novel possibilities for what he called new sociology, and further on what he called sociology of sociology. And in the best manner, it is expressed as reflexive sociology. His engagement with crisis is to develop this particular tendency within sociology, which is pretty novel a tendency. This tendency which will create an opportunity to do sociology of sociology, this tendency which is typically characterized by the word reflexivity, that tendency is being strengthened by Alvin Goldner while discussing crisis in Western sociology. What he had in mind was sociology with due radicalism, and thus with this due radicalism sociology that can enable us to be self-reflective. In this wake, Goldner says, and I quote, "The sociologist's task today is not only to see people as they see themselves, nor to see themselves as others see them. It is also to see themselves as they see other people. What it needs is a new and heightened self-awareness amongst sociologists, which would lead them to ask the same kind of question about themselves as they do about a taxi cab drivers or doctors, and to answer them in the same ways." Quote ends. Goldner could underline a methodologically significant proposition, joining in the epistemological discussion that we have been tracking throughout the lectures before this lecture. Goldner critiques methodological dualism based on feared vulnerability of the scholar's self. He goes on suggesting that in social sciences in general and sociology in particular, arguably methodology is determined by, to begin with, it is determined by this fear that one's personal passion, including disgust, pity, anger, outrage, etc., the fear that one's personal passions will interrupt public performances. According to Goldner, methodological dualism, which is evident way of coping with the fear of vulnerability, is about a perpetual dilemma, and the dilemma is whether to be ordinary person or a professional social scientist, whether to be a person of passion or be a person who can put aside passion in the act of knowing. Goldner observes, and I quote, in his own words he says, "Methodological dualism entails a fantasy of the sociologist's godlike invisibility and of his Olympian power to influence or not influence those around him as he pleases. In contrast, the methodological monism of a reflexive sociology believes that sociologists are really only mortal, that they inevitably change others and are changed by them, and that knowing and changing are distinguishable but not separable processes." This is pretty much radical of reflexive sociology, to put together knowing and changing, epistemological and transformative political together. This complicates the epistemological and methodological imagination that has prevailed upon us ever since the advent of modern science. On one hand, it is about operating with methodological dualism in order to shy away from what one could be, and one could be a vulnerable ego. And on the other hand, we come across an idea that it ought to be about pursuing methodological monism, in which the gap between the seeker of knowledge and subject is perpetually bridged. Goldner's critical comprehension and persuasion in 1970s had an interesting precursor in the decade of 1960s, and this precursor was in the work of the sociologist named C. Wright Mills. The classical work of C. Wright Mills opened up a great deal of possibilities of rethinking sociology. C. Wright Mills, who was also known as a guiding knight of radicalism for many in the decades of 1960s, he offered many ruptures. A key was the relation between biographical and historical, personal and public, that characterized the idea of sociological imagination of C. Wright Mills. Mills was critical of the tendency to follow a set of bureaucratic techniques. In his own words, I am quoting, he was critical of tendency to follow, underquote, a set of bureaucratic techniques which inhibit social inquiry by methodological pretensions, which congest such work by obscurantist conceptions, or which trivialize it by concern with minor problems unconnected with publicly relevant issues, quote ends. And along these lines, C. Wright Mills sounds a crisis in social studies due to the inhibitions, obscurities and trivialities that dominate what social scientists do. Interestingly enough, Mills is not a crisis monger. C. Wright Mills is not a crisis monger, which many could be in the context of South Asia and particularly in India. He sets a mission to rescue us from what he calls pale sociology. Pale sociology, which is literally, metaphorically pale. The best manifesto of the mission is in the appendix of the book titled The Sociological Imagination, and that manifesto is in the appendix of this book is titled On Intellectual Craftsmanship. In this deliberation, C. Wright Mills emphasizes the category of experience. Mills delivers an all-time relevant and insightful proposition as he puts, and I quote, "Scholarship is a choice of how to live as well as a choice of career. Whether he knows it or not, the intellectual workman forms his own self as he works toward the perfection of his craft. To realize his own potentialities and any opportunities that come his way, he constructs a character which has as its core the qualities of the good workman. What this means is that you must learn to use your life experience in your intellectual work, continually to examine and interpret it. In this sense, craftsmanship is the center of yourself, and you are personally involved in every intellectual product upon which you may work," quote ends. This is simple and sublime. This is stimulating, exciting proposition that emerges from C. Wright Mills. To give more concrete body to his proposition, C. Wright Mills discusses furthermore the imperative of a personal diary, a private journal, to capture fringe thoughts stemming from the experiences of everyday life, snatches of conversations overheard on the street, or for that matter, dreams. All of these become important components in the act of knowing, in the pursuit of knowledge. It indeed requires self-reflective habit, not necessarily through presentations in gala conferences or prestigious fellowships at highly ranked universities. It certainly does not come from the habit of writing a finished piece, which can be called a masterpiece, which can garner funding from various agencies, which can be awarded, rewarded by several agencies. No, even this is not the marker of good craftsmanship. About such practices, Mills has a sense of derision mixed with acceptance of inevitable. As he says, and I quote again, it is bound in some degree to be salesmanship. It is bound in some degree to be salesmanship, and given prevailing expectations, very likely to result in painstaking pretensions. The project is likely to be presented, rounded out in some arbitrary manner long before it ought to be. It is often contrived thing aimed at getting the money for ulterior purposes, however valuable as well as for the research presented. Mills is aware of the anomalies of the institutional professional practices in the realm of social sciences, and hence he is highlighting something which does not belong to the day-to-day practices, the ulterior motives, the kind of purposive rationality which governs the practices of social scientists. Instead, he is expecting them to do something more radical. Mills also admits the interventions of peers. The community of peers would begin to preserve disciplinary status quo, including the list of themes that ought to be researched into the areas be taught in teaching programs. He says, and I quote, "It is unlikely that in any free intellectual community there would be, and certainly there ought not to be, any monolithic array of problems. In such a community, were it flourishing in a vigorous way, there would be interludes of discussion among individuals about future work. Three kinds of interludes: on problem, methods, theory. These three kinds of interludes ought to come out of the work of social scientists and lead into it again. They should be shaped by work in progress and to some extent guide that work. It is for such interludes that a professional association finds its intellectual reason for being." One can ask, are there associations around endeavor to promote works in progress that could depart from the familiar list of thematic of inquiries in researches or teaching programs? Are there such associations which will promote intellectual adventurism, which will promote intellectual risk taking? How much of our works dwell upon our personal experiences that summon radical departure from the comfortable notions of being sociological? In other words, how much risk is undertaken in the three areas of interludes that Mills identified up in the previous quote? Are there interludes available in a chosen research problem, in method, in theories? Often our works are too clinical and smart to allow the relaxed ways that is essential for methodological innovation, for what Mills calls intellectual craftsmanship within social sciences. Our known ways of seeing, our familiar methodological apparatuses make us merely technicians, and one begins to see the problematic of being technician while one reads sociologists like Alvin Goldner and C. Wright Mills. There is a proposition for methodological innovations common in both Alvin Goldner and C. Wright Mills. In this context, it makes sense to revisit another classical work by someone called Robert Nisbet. His classical work which puts sociology arguably as an art form. Nisbet's intervention was made at a time which was characterized by crisis in Western sociology, and it still holds its relevance in the context of South Asia for sure, and of course, all over the world it is important. Bolstering, strengthening a case for sociology as an art form, Nisbet suggests, and I quote, "How alike are the sociologists and artists' efforts to endow subject matter with what Herbert Reed, the art historian and critic, has called the illusion of motion." No mean aesthetic skill is involved in Marx's depiction of capitalism as a structure in motion, in Tocqueville's rendering of equality as a dynamic process, or Weber's of rationalization. We cannot take away from Tocqueville, Marx, Weber and other sociologists the visions for which they are famous. But we live in ignorance if we do not see clearly these same visions, albeit stated differently in the earlier writings of such minds as Burke, Blake, Carlyle, Balzac, artists. There is, according to Nisbet, an essential unity of art and science, no matter how eclipsed it may seem in the wake of intellectual politics which separate the two. Presenting a diagnosis of the problem of scientism without diminishing the significance of science, and to emphasize the unity of science and art, Nisbet suggests that when Kepler, the scientist, wrote "The roads by which men arrive at their insights into celestial matters seem to be almost as worthy of wonder as those matters themselves." When Kepler wrote this, it would never have occurred to him that there was any significant difference between what he, the theologian, the philosopher and the artist were engaged in. Nisbet enlists a number of common thematic areas in social sciences in the 19th century, such as community, masses, power, development, progress, conflict, egalitarianism, anomie, alienation and disorganization. He also suggests that there are identical themes in the world of art, painting, literature, even music. Social scientists have benefited from their engagement with works of art and in comprehending their thematic realities. To make it more explicit, Robert Nisbet surmises, and I quote, "Scientists Marx, Weber, Durkheim and Simmel, they were without question scientists, but they were also artists, and had they not been artists, had they contented themselves with demonstrating solely what had been arrived at thorough aseptic problem design through meticulous verification and through constructions of theory which pass muster in a graduate course in methodology of sociology today. The entire world of thought would be much poorer had they not been artists. While being scientists, they were artists." Turning geopolitically inward, the sociological inclination toward art was not absent in the sociology in South Asia, though its influence has been historically muted. It is relevant to briefly allude to the extensive deliberations of Radha Kamal Mukherjee. Radha Kamal Mukherjee was one of the pioneering thinkers setting the temperament of sociology in India. Radha Kamal Mukherjee, who is accredited to have shaped up the way of doing sociology and anthropology while also engaging with economics at Lucknow University, is mostly known for his sociological challenge to the predominance of positivism of economics, but he also wrote a number of well known essays on the issue of art and its relation with society, civilization, religion and polity. One of the essays by Mukherjee, titled The Meaning of Evolution of Art in Society, was published in American Sociological Review in 1940s, precisely 45. And it is curious to take note of the editor of the journal adding a note on the publication of this essay authored by Radhakamal Mukherjee, and the note said, and I quote, "The editors think that American sociologists will be interested in the contemporary thinking of an eminent Indian sociologist in the eventful year of 1945. In a way, Mukherjee suggested an area of serious inquiry for social scientists, without which a crisis was in the making. He anticipated the crisis unless sociology and anthropology and larger area of social science engaged with the intellectual resources, the aesthetic materials, art and craft, civilizational religious issues, unless they engaged with all those things which were around, Mukherjee could anticipate some kind of problem for future, for sociology's future. He suggested that art is at once a social product and an established means of social control. He said modern sociologists should now vindicate the importance of this fertile field, the study of art forms as the unchecked efflorescence and clarified utterance of culture, as its principal measure, directive force as well as means of control. As obvious, Radhakamal Mukherjee was keen to develop a sociology which can engage with art in such a nuanced manner. Seemingly, there have not been serious engagement with such profound proposition that emerged in the intellectual history of social sciences in India. As obvious in the foregoing, we tend to vacillate between legitimacy of self-experiential methodological orientation and the cancellation of self altogether in our pursuit of knowledge. If sociology in India suffers this methodological dilemma, it is not without a reason and not without a background. We have tried understanding that background. But the lamentable part is that there is seldom an effort to move toward post-dilemma development in sociological discussions on methodology. And this calls for a strong polemic, no doubt about that. In that regard, we should recall a master thinker, another sociologist from, another pioneer who emerged from Lucknow sociology, namely D.P. Mukherjee, engaged with ifs and buts of sociological methodological inclination to scientific method. He said, and I quote this insightful idea that he offers us, "A pure science has been built up by intellect, by eschewing the concrete in the shape of practices and traditions, ethics, history, and lastly the subjective attitude." By eschewing all this concrete stuff. But all these are living factors, stern realities and facts as much as the so-called scientific facts. All these materials rebel not alone for being eliminated, but also for being tyrannized over in turn by intellect, which serves its function by reducing everything to a mechanism, the like producing the like. Very powerful intervention he makes by saying this in the scientific epistemology. Pretty early on in the frame of social science, someone like D.P. Mukherjee had already contested scientific epistemology. A semblance of post-positivist turn appeared pretty early on, as one can notice by engaging with some of the sociologists from Lucknow University, who were very crucial in the early days of sociology in India. The selectivity of scientific reason leaves behind philosophy and religion, causing an opposition of humanities and sciences. The two wings of university buildings accommodate these opposite disciplines, though the courses of study may have the same objective. And this is so common found. This is a situation of despair that demands from us, as Mukherjee suggested, a synthesis of objective and subjective in order to make sense of social relations. A rationalist perspective may discard not so rationalist, subjectivist and relativist account of social reality, and therefore Mukherjee says a scientific historian marshalling an array of facts cannot produce a book half so enjoyable as that of a nationalist historian, however unscientifically partial he may be. For his vision of his country as a person and his identification with it is clearer and closer, and as such his history becomes readable. A gardener in his garden is a more delightful man than the botanist in his laboratory. He will sing, but the other will not. Once again, very provocative and very insightful interjection. The critical engagement with the science question in social science began quite early in India. There are many such instances of methodological interrogations, systematic as well as polemical in nature. In the history of social sciences in South Asia, they offer very important signposts, and therefore it is very much necessary for us in this set of lecture to engage with those possibilities too, while discussing the canons and canonical understanding of scientific epistemology, positivism and post-positivist turn. Further, in his deliberation on intellectual progress, D.P. Mukherjee also advocated something which he calls, in his own words, derivative minds. Something he advocates, something like eccentricities. He promotes something like non-expertise in the intellectual pursuits of university academia, which is plagued by obsession with expertise, obsession with ordered, structured intellectual pursuits. This advocacy is indeed helpful in anticipating a qualitatively different kind of intellectual quest. For Mukherjee, it appears that some eccentricities will have to be cultivated. He believes that it has to be cultivated. Some non-expertise and some non-uniformities are supposed to be fostered. Some dangerous thoughts are supposed to be taught. A few reckless adventures are necessary to be undertaken, and it is in this way D.P. Mukherjee would imagine a better future for academic practices and intellectual craftsmanship in social sciences. According to him, the university should be the arena of a few of those such forays into the unknown. At present, unfortunately, as he says, they are not. There is much of full uniformity and too little of adventure in our grooves. Even the best of youth are apt to plat for safety and slither into lethargy after a period of romantic frustration. This brief realization with reference to a couple of social scientists from India and reading them alongside some of the Western social scientists who helped us realize the notion of crisis which had gripped Western sociology. Doing this exercise is in itself very sensitizing exercise. It summons from us a little more than textually informed reasoning with the possibilities in the field of methodology of social sciences. One has to be aware of the local tradition of critique of scientific epistemology, empiricism and positivism, and that would be a befitting response to Alvin Goldner's suggestion about doing sociology of sociology. When we do sociology of sociology, or in the same breath when we try to do sociology of social sciences in general, we would come across a very rich discursive trope of crisis, which is dominated by the register of lament, the liturgy of lament. On that trope of crisis, mostly we come across lament about decline, lament about the predominance of a particular variety of science/scientism, and in Indian part, when we come on that trope of crisis, we also hear the decline in standard, quality, rigor, course material, quality of research, academic writing, etc., etc. If one steer clear of all these notions of lament, one gets to see the possibility of revisiting the epistemological bedrock of social science. The epistemological bedrock which will enable us to critically revisit the nature of science, the nature and scope of science, exactly in the manner in which in the decade of 60s, sociologists who participated in the German positivist dispute and the way they engaged with Karl Popper's critical rationalism, that becomes similar kind of thing, exactly not a replica, but similar kind of critical engagement begins to appear from the trope of crisis, which is also shared by social scientists in South Asia. It is this possibility, this emergence of methodological discussion from the trope of crisis that we have tried to touch upon in today's discussion, in this lecture. In this lecture, in between, we also tried showing that some of those areas of inquiries which have been traditionally left behind for some other kind of disciplinary practitioners to come and engage with them, such as an area such as art and aesthetics, which has been left behind, left aside for some other kind of disciplinary practitioners, were quite crucial for the first generation of sociologists and social scientists. They intended to engage with some of those themes which are otherwise considered peripheral in the mainstream social science. Radha Kamal Mukherjee's engagement with art is a case in point. Likewise, Robert Nisbet's very persuasive style, of convincing us that, you know what, there is a relation between art and sociology. His rereading of some of those classical sociological works to show us that they are not only informed and influenced by art and aesthetics, they themselves become artifacts. The ideas emerging from classical sociology are themselves artifacts. These are suggestive of beautiful possibilities within social sciences, the possibilities which have been left unexhausted, which have been left untouched. It is these possibilities which will ensure that we make headway in our methodological discourses. It is these possibilities which will help us redo, strengthen philosophy of social sciences. कट कितना हुआ? उससे ज़्यादा अच्छी है। स्टाइल तो स्टाइल दिख रहा है बोलते वक्त में, मैंने वो हाथ वाथ जो ज़्यादा चलता है वो अटपट नहीं हो रहा है ना, मतलब गंदा तो नहीं हो रहा है ना, हाथ वाथ चल जाता है। मेरा हाथ बहुत चलता है, यहाँ मैं बहुत रोक के रखता हूँ। So, some of these discussions allow us to get a sense of how scholars from South Asia have been participating in critical debates on scientific epistemology, even though they do not figure in universal reckoning due to certain kind of intellectual politics. Their voices, their observations, their interjection in debates on scientific epistemology, positivism, do not appear prominently. We have tried taking note of their interventions in this lecture. However, while taking note of their interventions, as well as while discussing feminist epistemology and its quest of successor science, while briefly touching upon the debate between Gopal Guru and Sundar Sarukai, while looking at some of the feminist scholars from India, we came across an intrigue of experience, so to say. An intrigue of experience, since it is no longer that plain and simple version of experience which factored in scientific epistemology. It is a version of experience in the aftermath of critical debates on science. It's an intriguing version of experience in the aftermath of the so-called post-positivist turn in social sciences. It's intriguing. Why? Because it moots a very critical question as to whose experience really matters, which experience to be trusted, which experiential account to be taken more seriously, which experiential account has lesser credibility, whose experience matters, experience of those who have no choice but to be in that situation of experience, or experience of those who have a choice who are participant observer, so to say, in typical social scientific methodological term, who are participant observer, and therefore, they have a choice to step out of the domain of experience if the domain of experience is very uncomfortable. These kind of questions allow us to rethink the category of reflexivity. The category of reflexivity, which appeared very sharply in this lecture, is going to be debated furthermore in the last lecture, lecture number 10. However, we try to summarize the whole thing by taking note of the fact that experience with complexity assumes centrality in the post-positivist explorations in social sciences. We have also noted that experience was not entirely absent before the turn to post-positivism. Experience assumed a partial significance in the scientific epistemology. It was a particular kind of experience that was configured in the philosophical meditations of René Descartes, the wisdom capsules of Francis Bacon, methodologically detailed discussions of John Locke on empiricism, and so forth. The category of experience was not absent in the wake of Newtonianism either, nor was it insignificant for the forerunners of sociology, who we discussed in the previous lectures. The positivist sociology underlined that part of experience which could be free from prejudices as they promised. In the post-positivist scenario, this is no longer experience of the kind that scientific epistemology propounded as a premise of relatively indubitable knowledge. It is not an experience of detached observer about attached subjects alone. It is accompanied with recognition that the detached observer is capable to be as attached as his or her subjects. And moreover, it is a complex category of experience riddled with the partisan values, heterogeneous perspectives, and divides along various lines, including class, caste, and gender, which are popular in sociological discussions. Moreover, the divide along socio-political lines, such as former colonizer and the colonized, figure in the realms of experience too. While the colonizers and their native counterparts who imbibe the values of the colonizers may seem surprised, this is natural to witness a violent expressions of victims' experience. The historical encounters are never absent in the category of experience. The turf of experience is indeed thoroughly contested, and it is upon this contested terrain we find it possible to mount further contestation. This is what we have tried doing in this lecture. We have tried exploring the possibilities of further contestation by looking at some of the insightful interjections which pave our way for further discussion in the next lecture. In the next lecture, we return headlong on the category of reflexivity, and we try to see whether this category of reflexivity in social science practices can in some way help us redress the enigma of experience, whether it can help us in finding a provisional answer to the intrigue of experience in social science pursuit of knowledge. We will do all these things in the next lecture. Thank you. कितना हुआ अब? 49। और तेरी भला, मुझे लगा कि हाथ दिखा दिए तो हो गया होगा. The experience of oppressed, the experiences of oppressor, experience of colonizer, experience of colonized, experience of victims, experiences of those who belong to the margin of socio-political arrangement. Put together, all such experiences would make it nearly impossible to abide by the simpler version of experience which was propounded in scientific epistemology. And in that regard, when we engage ourselves in the contestation, we also try to explore the possibility of way forward. Instead of getting lost in the dualism between universalism and relativism, it is our methodological requirement to find a way forward where we are not prisoner of the familiar vocabulary, whereby we are enabled to take note of the complexity of experience in the aftermath of the switch from methodological dualism to methodological monism that Alvin Goldner propounded in order to advocate reflexivity in social science. We remember with Alvin Goldner that methodological dualism has caused great deal of intellectual schizophrenia of some sort. Intellectual schizophrenia which requires us to be one thing in the domain of professional social scientific practices and yet another thing in our day-to-day life. An intellectual schizophrenia which was addressed in some way, however milder way, in the phenomenological discussion of Edmund Husserl and subsequently Alfred Schuss. By the way of talking about different provinces of meaning, they had shown us, Alfred Schuss had shown us that scientist or theorist belong to a particular province of meaning, a particular province where a particular kind of experience is celebrated, a particular kind of experience is taken into account as credible premise for building up an argument, whereas there is other kind of meaning, province of meaning populated by the lay persons, ordinary folks who live their life following certain kind of recipes of actions, following certain kind of stock of knowledge, certain kind of typologies, stereotypes, categories, notions and value orientation, and they tried showing phenomenologically as to how theorist is also connected with that province of meaning populated by the ordinary folks. However, the twine was not absolutely and adequately bridged. The gap was not adequately bridged. It is with Alvin Goldner that we tried to understand as to how any kind of bridge between my professional self as a social scientist and my personal self as a social actor, how that can be bridged. We will continue with this discussion with more focus on the category of reflexivity with an objective to find a solution to the intrigue of this complex version of experience in the next lecture. Thank you.